I'll marry you to my son if you can make him smile again. Don Alexander's deep voice echoed throughout the luxurious restaurant in Los Angeles, drawing laughter and mocking stares. Before him, an overweight, humble waitress held the tray with trembling hands, never imagining that this public humiliation would change the course of many lives. The challenge seemed cruel, almost impossible. After all, his son Daniel hadn't smiled since his mother's death, and everyone knew it. But what Alexander didn't know is that the woman he had just ridiculed carried within her something that all his fortune could never buy, a heart capable of healing wounds that money could never reach. And that night, the laughter he swore never to see again would be born from the hands of the one he despised. The restaurant, the Crystal Dome in Los Angeles, was the type of place where even the air seemed to dress in luxury. The silver cutlery reflected the yellowish light from the chandeliers. The glasses clinked like delicate bells, and the laughter sounded more rehearsed and sincere. There, each table was a stage, and Don Alexander, the most feared and admired millionaire in the city, knew very well how to be the protagonist. That night, like so many others, was a showcase of power, a parade of appearances. But it took just one small slip for the mask of elegance to transform into cruelty. Isabella Carter, an overweight waitress, worked with the attention of someone carrying the world on their shoulders. Her steps were quick, her smile gentle, and even though she was tired, she treated each customer with sweetness. Until, while serving wine at the main table, a few drops escaped from the glass and stained Don Alexander's expensive jacket. An uncomfortable silence spread through the room. The millionaire stood up slowly, wiping the fabric with disdain, and looked at Isabella with that cold stare of someone who doesn't see a person but a mistake. Contained laughter began to emerge here and there, fueled by collective discomfort. The atmosphere, once refined, became a field of judgment. It was then that Alexander, with a tone of voice that seemed to mix irony and contempt, decided to turn the situation into a spectacle. "They say you have a beautiful smile, girl," he provoked, making a calculated pause so everyone would pay attention. "Well, I want to see if you're capable of making my son smile. If you succeed, I'll marry you to him." The word sounded like a blow. The laughter came quickly, sharp, like thin blades. It was one of those phrases that, alone, carry the weight of humiliation. The waitress stood still, trying to process what she had just heard. It was as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Some guests laughed openly. Others disguised their discomfort by looking away. But Isabella, inside, struggled to keep the tears from falling. She had already been called so many things because of her body, had already heard so many jokes disguised as banter, that she learned to raise an invisible wall. Except that night, it wasn't just about her. It was about the way everyone around stayed silent in the face of cruelty. And that hurt even more. There was something deeply symbolic in that scene. Power mocking simplicity, wealth trampling on dignity, laughter used as a weapon. But what Don Alexander didn't perceive, and perhaps had never stopped to see, is that by doing this, he revealed much more about himself than about Isabella. Because the true value of someone isn't in their clothes, money, or appearance. It's in the way they treat those who have nothing to offer them. While he laughed, Isabella raised her gaze and, without saying a single word, met the eyes of Daniel, the millionaire's son. That young man seemed oblivious to the scene, as if he weren't really there. There was something broken in his gaze, a deep, ancient sadness that revealed an emptiness that luxury doesn't fill. Isabella perceived this immediately, like someone who recognizes pain because they felt it before, and in that instant, something awakened inside her. It wasn't anger, nor desire for revenge. It was compassion, a silent will to return color to the gaze of someone living in gray. She didn't know yet how, but she knew she would try. Because even when the world tries to crush who we are, there are some people with a light that simply doesn't go out. And it was that light, hidden under pain and shame, that was about to transform the impossible into reality, and change the course of that story. The next day, the restaurant seemed the same, but something in the air had changed. Some employees still whispered about what happened the night before, commenting on how Isabella had held firm through the public humiliation. She, for her part, arrived early, as she always did, in a clean uniform with a smile on her face. And that was what most intrigued those who lived with her, the almost magical ability to transform pain into kindness. While many carried the weight of pride, Isabella carried the rare gift of lightness. Her laughter echoed between the tables, and somehow she managed to break the ice even with the grumpiest customers. When she delivered the plates, she always said something simple. "Enjoy your meal, sir," or "May your day be sweet." But the way she said it made it different. It wasn't automatic. It was human. And it's curious to think how, sometimes, a simple gesture of tenderness can illuminate an entire environment. People who before looked at her with contempt began, little by little, to surrender to her sympathy. And even though prejudice was still there, hovering like a shadow, Isabella never let that steal the brightness of her soul. She had a rare talent, seeing people. Not the titles, not the clothes, not the money, but what existed behind. It was as if she had an invisible radar perceive when someone needed a friendly word, an encouraging look, or even a simple smile. Many of the restaurant's most loyal customers came not for food, but for the good feeling that Isabella left. It was the type of presence that didn't go unnoticed, even when she tried to hide. She knew each customer's name, remembered what each one liked to order, asked about their children, gave sincere advice. And the most beautiful thing is that none of this was rehearsed. Isabella was genuine, and in a world where almost everything is appearance, being genuine is almost an act of rebellion. Sometimes, a co-worker would comment, "I don't know how you put up with it, Izzy. I would have told everyone to go to hell by now." She just smiled and responded, "We don't change the world by fighting with it. We change it by being different from it." And she continued serving, laughing, charming, as if she spread small sparks of hope wherever she went. But there was something deeper behind all that joy. No one knew how much it cost to maintain that brightness. At night, when she arrived home, Isabella would take off her shoes and sigh long and silently. The tears she didn't shed at the restaurant fell there, between the simple walls of her small room. It was the price of being strong in a world that insists on testing us every day. Even so, she never stopped being who she was. There was inside her a conviction almost naive, but powerful. That kindness isn't weakness, it's strength. And perhaps that's why her charisma was so different. It wasn't something learned, it was something felt. When she smiled, there was truth. When she spoke, there was presence. When she listened, there was soul. It was this authenticity that, without her knowing it, was beginning to touch Daniel's heart, the young man who until then lived submerged in shadows. And although Isabella didn't know it yet, destiny was already preparing the reunion between these two worlds. One, surrounded by gold but empty. The other, surrounded by simplicity but full of light. The first encounter between Isabella and Daniel happened almost imperceptibly, as if destiny had blown a discreet breeze just to unite two opposite worlds. He arrived at the restaurant accompanied by his father, with a lost gaze, showing no interest in the environment or the people. There was something broken inside him, something his eyes didn't hide. Isabella saw him from afar, sitting at the most expensive table, the plate untouched, shoulders tense. And in that instant, she felt something different. It wasn't pity nor curiosity. It was recognition. She knew what it was to carry the weight of silence, the burden of pain that no one understands. While serving other tables, her gaze involuntarily returned to him, as if trying to decipher the reason for so much sadness. Daniel, for his part, seemed oblivious to everything, to his father talking with businessmen, to the forced laughter, to the expensive perfume of the women around, until, in a brief moment of carelessness, his eyes met hers. It was a short instant, but intense enough to freeze time. And for the first time in a long time, someone looked at him without judging him, without pity, without hidden intentions, just with humanity. Isabella said nothing. She just continued doing her work, discreet, attentive, gentle. But something in the way she moved caught attention. The calm, the patience, the way she cleaned the tables, as if that act had value. And Daniel, who for months had been numbed by antidepressants and emptiness, found himself watching her without understanding why. The sound of her laughter, light and sincere, broke something inside him, as it opened a tiny crack in the wall surrounding him. His father, Don Alexander noticed his son's gaze and, without imagining what was being born there, found it amusing. She's good with people, isn't she? Who knows? Maybe she'll accomplish what even the doctors couldn't. The words came out in an ironic tone, but Destiny has its own sense of humor, because it was precisely the woman he considered irrelevant who would begin to rekindle life in his son. Daniel looked away, embarrassed, but that scene had already marked him. For the first time since he lost his mother, he felt a spark. It wasn't joy, it was curiosity, it was calm, it was presence. It was as if, when looking at Isabella, the whole world stopped hurting, even if just for a few seconds. That night, as Daniel returned home, something in him insisted on revisiting her. The smile, the gaze, the way she didn't bow to contempt. He remembered her voice saying, "Enjoy your meal," a banal phrase, but it sounded different, alive. For the first time in months, he felt like dreaming. And the most impressive thing is that Isabella, at that exact moment, was also thinking about him, without understanding why. She felt there was something behind those tired eyes, something that made her want to discover. And although the whole world said they belonged to different universes, the heart never followed social rules. The empathetic gaze that united them that day was the first thread of an invisible bond, a bond woven not by blind destiny, but by the delicacy of souls that recognize each other in pain. And even though neither of them was aware of it, that brief encounter was the beginning of a story that would prove that sometimes a sincere look is enough to rekindle an entire life. In the following days, Daniel began to frequent the restaurant with a frequency that made no sense even to him. He told his father he wanted to follow the family business. But deep down, there was something much deeper drawing him there. Isabella, on the other hand, tried to act naturally, although she felt her heart race every time she saw that distant gaze watching her in silence. It was a gaze that asked for nothing, but said everything. A gaze from someone who had already been in the abyss and recognized someone who also learned to survive in it. Between one order and another, they began to exchange almost imperceptible gestures, a discreet smile, a whispered, "Thank you," a quick glance that met by chance. For the rest of the world, that was nothing more than courtesy. But inside them, something had already changed. Daniel began to notice how much he waited for that simple moment of the day. It wasn't about the food, nor about the environment. It was about her, about the way Isabella seemed to exist on a different frequency, as if she were immune to the rush and cynicism of the modern world. And although he didn't know what he felt, he knew he wanted to feel more. But, as always happens when something true begins to flourish, prejudice didn't take long to appear. Isabella's co-workers noticed Daniel's interest and began the cruel jokes. "Look at that! The princess conquering the prince," mocked the waiter. "Watch out! He might want you to wash the castle's dishes." The laughter sounded like knives disguised as humor. Isabella pretended not to care, but inside, she felt small, vulnerable. She had been judged for her body her whole life, and now what she feared most was about to happen again, being ridiculed for dreaming. Meanwhile, Daniel also faced judgment at home. When his father noticed that his son was beginning to open up, he became confused. The same man who, in an impulse of anger, had said the phrase that gave rise to the challenge, "I'll marry you to my son if you can make him smile again," now saw this becoming a real possibility. And, paradoxically, he didn't know whether to laugh or get irritated. He couldn't allow the heir to his fortune to get involved with someone like that. The class difference, the weight of appearance, the fear of scandal, all of this seemed more important than his own son's happiness. Even so, Destiny didn't back down. One afternoon, the restaurant faced a power outage, and a good part of the staff was dismissed early. Daniel, who happened to be there, took advantage of the moment to approach. He offered help carrying boxes, and Isabella, surprised, accepted. For the first time, they really talked about simple things, the heat, the food, the routine. But it was a different conversation, without masks. Isabella discovered that, behind a fame and powerful surname, there was a man tired of living a life he didn't choose. And Daniel discovered that, under the stained apron, there was a woman who saw beauty in small things, a woman who believed that each person deserves to be loved for who they are, not for what they have. When they said goodbye, The sun was already setting, and the two stood still for a few seconds, just looking at each other without saying anything. Sometimes silence is the most sincere form of communication, and in that instant both knew, even without admitting it, that they were beginning to truly find each other. The moment no one expected finally happened. In the middle of the restaurant service, Daniel, who until then remained distant and introspective, let slip a small smile, almost shy, but full of meaning. Isabella, who was passing by his table, noticed immediately. For an instant, the world seemed to stop. The trays, the clinking cutlery, the expensive perfume of each guest. Everything disappeared, and only that simple but powerful gesture remained. She smiled back, not theatrically, but with the lightness that only those who understand another's pain know how to offer. It was a silent confirmation that her presence didn't go unnoticed, that kindness and empathy really had the power to touch hearts. Some customers noticed the exchange of glances, but didn't understand the depth of the moment. For them, it was just a casual interaction. But for these two 20-year-olds, it was as if a heavy veil had been lifted from their souls, revealing colors that had long been hidden under the gray of sadness and routine. And, in that instant, Isabella knew that accepting Alexander's challenge went far beyond what it seemed. It wasn't just a test, it was a mission of human reconnection. Don Alexander, who was watching everything from the main table, was completely disconcerted. Daniel's smile wasn't just unexpected, it was impossible to control. It broke the control he always believed he had over his son. The millionaire tried to disguise it with a nervous laugh, but the tension was visible. Every muscle in his face seemed to fight between wounded pride and disbelief. He realized that this simple gesture, something he considered banal, even ridiculous, had a real human impact that money could never buy. Alexander was left speechless, and the restaurant's elegant atmosphere, one so secure, seemed more vulnerable than ever. Some employees glanced sideways, trying to decipher what was happening, but no one dared approach or comment. And it's curious to notice how, in life, small moments can have enormous effects. A genuine laugh, a gesture of empathy, a sincere smile, all capable of shaking the most solid structure of arrogance. Isabella, still unaware of the dimension of the impact she had caused, only felt an inner peace, the same feeling we have when we do good, without expecting anything in return. But the disconcerting silence didn't stop there. The entire restaurant stood still, as if holding its breath, witnessing the silent transformation of the space. Daniel continued to smile discreetly, now more open, lighter, and each small gesture was reverberated in the atmosphere, leaving Alexander increasingly uncomfortable. He tried, with jokes and comments, to reverse the situation, trying to transform that moment into a joke, but was too late. The power of Isabella's action spoke louder than any wealth or sarcasm, and, without realizing it, a new dynamic was emerging. The young heir, who before hid in his own emptiness, was beginning to rediscover life, while the overweight waitress, with her humanity, was becoming the center of something much bigger than she could imagine. With each smile, with each simple gesture, a bridge formed between them, silent, almost imperceptible, but resistant as steel. What began as public humiliation was slowly transforming into genuine connection, and Alexander, no matter how much he tried to disguise it, no longer knew if he controlled what was happening before his eyes. Despite the unexpected effect of her smile, Isabella couldn't escape the cruelty of the real world. At the end of her shift, Don Alexander called her discreetly, but enough for everyone to notice. The atmosphere changed instantly. From laughter and light conversations, the restaurant began to tremble with the weight of a sentence that seemed absurd. "You crossed the line, girl," he said, harshly, without even mentioning the positive effect her presence had had on Daniel. There was no recognition, no gratitude, only judgment, based on a cold logic of power and appearance. Isabella felt her heart tighten, but maintained her composure. She knew she had done something important, even if no one there saw it. It was like when someone plants seeds in hard soil. It may seem in vain, but growth will come silent, unexpected, and powerful. Upon hearing the dismissal, many emotions came to the surface: sadness, indignation, even a certain fear of the future. But the girl, who for years had faced daily prejudice for being overweight, was accustomed to getting up even when the world seemed to collapse on her. She took a deep breath, adjusted her apron, and left the restaurant with her head held high, carrying something that Alexander could never take from her: dignity. As she walked through the simple streets of the city, Isabella felt the weight of what had just happened: the cruel words, the look of disapproval, the malicious laughter of some co-workers. All of this floated in her mind like heavy clouds. But there was also something different, a sense of silent purpose. Each step she took reminded her that, even when we're punished for spreading kindness, life always finds a way to reward courage. And deep down, Isabella knew that this decision to stand firm before the millionaire hadn't gone unnoticed. Daniel, who until then lived closed in his own world, not only noticed each gesture of hers, but also felt a silent gratitude that no money could buy. The injustice she faced seemed paradoxical. Although the world had tried to crush her, it was exactly her strength and authenticity that were beginning to transform something deep inside the young man. It was proof that simple gestures, when done from the heart, always reverberate beyond what the eyes can see. And, indeed, life didn't take long to show that Isabella's courage wouldn't be in vain. Days later, while Alexander believed the episode had already been forgotten, Daniel began to act differently. Small gestures, lingering looks, attempts at contact, signs that the connection they had initiated wouldn't fade so easily. While the world tried to punish the girl, she had planted something greater, a genuine feeling that was beginning to grow, silent but intense. Each step Isabella took out of the restaurant was a step toward a change that neither she nor Alexander could control. And although she didn't know it yet, that simple act of dignity, of not bowing to humiliation, would plant the seeds of friendship that would become affection, complicity, and eventually love. The stage was set, the scene arranged, and life, with all its unpredictability, about to reveal that real power wasn't in money or authority, but in the ability to touch another human being's heart. And so, without anyone expecting it, a new chapter was beginning to be written, silent, firm, and transformative. Days after what happened at the restaurant, destiny took charge of bringing Daniel and Isabella together in an unexpected way. The young man, who for months had lived submerged in his own loneliness, walked to Isabella's small house holding a bouquet of simple flowers, but chosen with care and attention. Each flower seemed to carry a silent message: recognition, gratitude, and admiration. Isabella, seeing the familiar figure at the door, felt her heart race. It wasn't just surprise. It was a mixture of expectation and caution. She had learned to protect herself, to raise walls so as not to be hurt by others' judgment. But in that instant, a different sensation arose, as if an invisible thread connected her to Daniel, crossing not only the physical space, but also all the pains and injustices that each one carried. He placed the flowers on the table carefully, almost reverently, and his gaze no longer sought approval or attention. It sought only presence, like someone who finally finds someone who understands their silence. The atmosphere that formed in that small reunion was intense and silent, loaded with contained emotions. Daniel, who rarely allowed himself to show any type of vulnerability, began to speak with an almost palpable hesitation. "I had never felt something like this. Someone really made me feel alive again." Each word of his was measured, almost whispered, but carried a sincerity that pierced Isabella's heart. She felt in that instant that all the effort, all the kindness, hadn't been in vain. The shy smile that appeared on her lips revealed more than gratitude. It revealed the depth of a newly discovered connection, based on empathy and authenticity. It was as if the world had stopped out there, and only that moment existed, where Daniel's passive sadness met Isabella's courage and inner light. The waitress perceived that, even though it was just a simple encounter, something magical was happening. A bond was forming, silent, but strong enough to resist any external obstacle. From that moment on, the relationship between them began to strengthen naturally, like a plant that sprouts slowly from arid soil, but insists on growing. Daniel began to visit Isabella more frequently, bringing not just flowers, but small words, shared laughter, and moments of lightness that he had lost long ago. Each encounter was full of discoveries. He learned to laugh again. She learned to trust the feeling that was born there, and both realized that this was much more than friendship. Cooking together, walking through the city, talking about dreams and fears. Each gesture reinforced complicity that grew silently between them. Isabella, overweight and underestimated by so many, now became essential to Daniel's happiness, and he, once imprisoned by sadness and pain, was beginning to rediscover life. In this process, both were transformed, showing that true bonds are born from the heart, not from appearances or power. The stage was set for the story to continue, now with emotion, affection, and discoveries that no one could predict, preparing the ground for the next chapter. The true approach in the growth of their complicity. As the days passed, Daniel's presence in Isabella's life became increasingly constant, no longer as a shy visitor, but as someone who wanted to be near her genuinely. They began to share small routines that, to someone looking from outside, might seem banal, but that for them had immense value. Cooking together transformed into a silent ritual of connection. He cut the vegetables carefully. She explained the recipes with patience and humor, and each laugh that emerged seemed to dissolve the weight of past sadnesses. The conversations went far beyond food. They talked about memories, dreams, fears, and small daily victories. And, even with life differences, there was an almost perfect balance between them. Daniel, the young man accustomed to luxury and his father's suffocating expectations, learned to value simplicity. Isabella, the girl underestimated for being overweight, realized that her value went far beyond what the world said. Each encounter seemed like a silent step toward trust. Each gesture carried the strength of empathy and acceptance. As they grew closer, complicity grew naturally and organically. They discovered nuances about each other that no one else saw. The way Daniel furrowed his brow when he was concentrated, or how Isabella illuminated any environment with her contagious laughter. Small details became big signs of intimacy. Walks through the city became adventures, and seemingly common moments, like having coffee or walking in silence, were filled with a sense of belonging and welcoming. Daniel, who before could barely smile, now began to allow himself to laugh for real, with a light and pulsing heart. Isabella, for a part, felt a deep joy in realizing she could touch someone so significantly, without needing to change who she was or submit to others' expectations. It was as if the world had shrunk in size, and they could exist only in the safe space they built together, ignoring judgments and external barriers. But even in this environment of growth and trust, Daniel's father's shadow remained silent, watching from a distance. Don Alexander, accustomed to controlling everything and everyone, was beginning to notice that his son was transforming more and more in Isabella's presence. Each smile, each gesture of care, and each moment of complicity seemed to irritate and confuse the millionaire. He saw, with growing discomfort, that this bond wasn't just friendship. There was something deeper emerging, something he couldn't manipulate with money or authority. And still, he insisted on believing he could interfere, that he could impose limits and dictate rules about feelings that weren't his to control. But Daniel, strengthened by Isabella's genuine affection, was beginning to realize that his own happiness could no longer be dictated by his father. The closeness between the two young people wasn't just physical or emotional. It was an awakening to a new life made of trust, respect, and tenderness. And so, as each day passed, the bond between them strengthened, preparing the ground for the conflicts that would inevitably arise when Alexander finally tried to intervene, opening the way for the next chapter of the story. When Don Alexander finally realized that the friendship between Daniel and Isabella wasn't fleeting, but rather a growing and deep bond, he felt his pride wounded like never before. The millionaire, accustomed to controlling every step of his son and dictating who deserved or not his company, decided to confront Isabella directly. He appeared at her house with an air of authority and disdain, surrounded by wealth and power that, for him, should intimidate. "You're only interested in my son's money," he said firmly, trying to impose fear and guilt. But Isabella, who had faced so many humiliations and prejudices throughout her life for being overweight, didn't back down. Her firm gaze met his, and with a calm but unwavering voice, she responded, "I only want to give back the smile that you took from him." In that moment, the space filled with an almost palpable tension, where there was no wealth, status, or authority capable of erasing the truth that overflowed from those words. The confrontation continued, and Don Alexander tried to use cold arguments. Fame, power, social differences, class expectations. Everything he believed essential to maintain the order he imposed. But each word fell into an abyss of honesty and integrity that Isabella carried within herself. She didn't back down before the accusations, didn't let herself be intimidated by the threatening tone or the flaunted money. On the contrary, her firm and human manner exposed a millionaire's own fragility, a man rich in goods, but poor in understanding and affection. Daniel, who watched the scene closely, felt a mix of pride and relief. He realized that his happiness, which was pulsing with intensity thanks to Isabella, wouldn't be sabotaged by anyone anymore. And, in that instant, the power of love, empathy, and the courage of a common person began to impose itself over the arrogance and vanity of someone who believed they could control others' feelings. The conversation reached a decisive point when Alexander, frustrated, tried to appeal to veiled threats. "If you continue to get close to my son, you'll regret it." But Isabella, with serenity and firmness, maintained her position. She wasn't there to discuss wealth, appearance, or status. She was there to defend humanity, joy, and Daniel's freedom. Her courage, the clarity of intentions, and the firmness of her principles began to disarm Alexander silently, almost imperceptibly. Each gesture of hers, each word, revealed that true value isn't in gold or titles, but in the ability to touch someone's heart, to spread kindness and truth. And while the millionaire tried to control what he couldn't, Daniel drew even closer to Isabella, feeling that he could finally live without fear, without barriers, and without judgments. The confrontation didn't end with apparent victories or defeats, but with the revelation that Isabella's strength of character and authenticity were more powerful than any imposition, preparing the ground for the transformative ending of the story. The impact of the confrontation reverberated more than anyone could imagine. Don Alexander, for the first time, felt the weight of his own actions reflected in his son's eyes. He realized he had underestimated not only Isabella, but also Daniel's capacity to recognize and value genuine feelings. That smile, which he had so mocked in his arrogance, was now visible, constant, and carried a joy that no money could buy. He felt ashamed, almost lost, before the authenticity of the girl who had always been considered irrelevant because of her appearance. It was the first time in a long time that Alexander understood that real value isn't measured by wealth, title, or appearance, but by the heart and the ability to touch lives with empathy and sincerity. And it was in that instant that something began to change inside him. A genuine regret, a sincere will to redeem himself, to recognize that he had been completely wrong about what really mattered. Recognizing his mistakes, Alexander approached Isabella humbly, asking for forgiveness sincerely. He invited her to be part of the family, not out of convenience, but as a gesture of respect and recognition for the courage and character she demonstrated. Isabella, with her silent wisdom, accepted the request not for the status or wealth, but for the real value she saw in the gesture and the man's transformation before her. Daniel, who watched the entire scene, felt his heart overflow. For the first time in a long time, there was no fear, judgment, or restriction. There was only love, understanding, and belonging. The three, somehow, now found themselves in a space of humanity, where past mistakes served as learning and the sincerity of feelings was the only guide. It was a moment of reconciliation, but also of celebration of the authenticity, courage, and kindness that Isabella had always carried. And finally, Daniel and Isabella could live the love that was born between them, lightly, truly, and deeply. Each encounter, each smile, each gesture of care consolidated a relationship based on complicity, respect, and mutual admiration. Alexander, once arrogant and domineering, learned that wealth and power don't replace empathy and truth, and that the heart is always the greatest treasure. The story, which began with cruel humiliation and an ironic challenge, transformed into a testimony of the strength of humanity, authenticity, and the impact that a genuine person can have on another's life. Daniel found joy, Isabella found recognition and belonging, and Alexander found a lesson that would change his vision of the world forever. And so, that episode that seemed just another whim of destiny became a narrative of love, transformation, and hope, showing that life's true wealth is in what we feel and share, not in what we possess. This story reminds us that someone's true value isn't in appearance, wealth, or status, but in courage, empathy, and authenticity. Isabella showed that small gestures and sincere attitudes can transform lives, rekindle smiles, and create deep connections, even in the face of humiliation and prejudice. And you, are you willing to act with courage, resist others' judgment, and spread kindness without expecting anything in return? If so, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, share your opinion in the comments, and start now to put into practice everything you learned. Because change begins in your hands, and your story can be as inspiring as this one.